So tonight, we're going to tell a story that's powerful, emotional, and real. Not just a bedtime tale, but a journey. We're going back in time, deep into the 1700s, to witness the life of a young African man, free in his homeland, before everything changed. This isn't your usual history lesson. We're diving into what it felt like to live through it, to lose your land, your name, and yet somehow hold on to your spirit. Now, if stories like these move you or help you drift off into deep thought or deeper sleep, I'd really appreciate a like or a subscribe. And hey, let me know where you're listening from. It's always incredible hearing how people across the world are finding rest through these voices of the past. So go ahead, get comfortable. Let your body sink into whatever you're lying on. Close your eyes. Slow your breath. We're stepping into a story of survival, of loss, of strength, of what it meant to be bound but not broken. This is Bound Yet Unbroken. The wind swept gently across the tall grass of the Ashanti Plains as the sun stretched its golden arms across the horizon. Morning dew clung to the blades like memories too stubborn to let go. In the village of Esuma, the sounds of waking life began their daily rhythm. Goats bleated, women's voices sang softly as they pounded millet, and children's laughter echoed faintly beneath the rustle of palms. Among them was Kofi, a boy of barely 17 rainy seasons, with shoulders already broad from carrying his father's spears and a spirit shaped by songs of warriors and ancestors. He had risen early, as he always did, with dreams still clinging to his lashes. The night had shown him a vision, his grandfather, cloaked in red earth and firelight, speaking in riddles. "The trees remember," the old man had said, "and so must you." Kofi did not understand, but he carried the weight of those words with him like a second skin. Today was to be a day of training. He had begun the rites of manhood and was expected to hunt his first boar before the dry season ended. His father, Kwabena, was a respected warrior of the clan, stern and silent, but proud. There was little room for weakness in Esuma, not with rival tribes and whispers of white men's ships slithering along the coasts. Kofi gripped his carved spear and followed his father into the bush, their footsteps soundless, their presence a whisper among leaves. They moved like ghosts, careful and aware, but the silence this morning felt different, heavier, as if the forest held its breath. Birds did not call, the wind stopped speaking, and then it happened. A sudden crack of gunfire split the air, unnatural, foreign. Kofi flinched. His father shouted something too fast to catch, then shoved him behind a thick tree. The world erupted in chaos. Men with pale skin and others dressed in strange tribal markings charged from the forest, muskets roaring, nets flying. Esuma was under attack. Kofi's legs moved before his mind could catch up. He ran, heart thundering, ducking low, breath scraping in his throat. He saw his uncle fall with a spear in his side. He saw a girl he knew from the river, Amma, dragged by her braids, her screams swallowed by fire and ash. He tried to return to help, but rough hands caught him, too strong, too many. A blow to the head silenced his thoughts. Darkness fell like a curtain. When he awoke, he was in chains. The world was rocking beneath him. A foul stench invaded his lungs. Kofi blinked against the dimness and found himself packed among dozens of others, chained at the ankles, lying in a wooden belly that stank of sweat, vomit, and fear. The ship groaned like a dying animal. The sea was no longer a story told by fishermen. It was now the color of grief. Time blurred. The days bled together, marked only by the groans of the dying and the prayers of the living. Language no longer mattered. Grief spoke louder than words. Kofi tried to remember Esuma, his mother's laugh, the feel of warm soil beneath his feet, but those memories grew thinner, like cloth worn to threads. One night, a storm broke over the Atlantic. The ship rocked violently, throwing bodies against wood and iron. Screams merged with thunder. A man beside Kofi broke his chains and leapt into the sea, only to vanish beneath the black waves. Kofi held on. He did not know why. Perhaps some part of him still believed in his grandfather's words, that the trees remembered, that he must too. When the ship finally reached land, the sun burned hotter and whiter than anything Kofi had ever known. He was dragged from the hold like cattle, blinked against the light, and stumbled into a new world, one that smelled of smoke, sugarcane, and sorrow. They called it Charleston. He stood on an auction block, eyes glazed, body aching. A man prodded his arms, examined his teeth like one would a mule. Kofi did not flinch. He would not give them the satisfaction. But he felt the crack of the whip across his back when he refused to bow. Blood ran freely, and still he did not scream. He was sold to a man named Barrett, a sugar planter with cold eyes and a voice like rotting wood. Kofi was given a new name, Jacob, but he spat it on the ground. The overseer taught him the price of defiance. Still, Kofi kept the name buried in his heart. Kofi, the one his mother gave him, the one the trees remembered. His days became filled with toil. From sun-up to sundown, he labored in the fields, back bent, hands raw. At night, he lay in a wooden shed with others, men and women who had once been kings, healers, dancers and warriors, now stripped of titles but not of spirit. They whispered stories to one another, some of escape, some of revenge, some of a land where no whip ever cracked and no chain ever bound a soul. Kofi listened. He learned. There was a man, Elias, who had once escaped for 3 weeks before being dragged back half dead. He walked with a limp and a quiet fire in his eyes. He taught Kofi how to read signs in the trees, how to move without leaving footprints. One day, Elias would say, "You'll find your moment. Don't waste it." Years passed, or perhaps only months. Time lost, meaning beneath the weight of survival. But Kofi grew stronger, not just in body, but in mind. He learned English in secret. He watched how the plantation ran, who spoke to whom, where the guards relaxed when they drank too much. He watched and waited. One night, as the moon hung low and swollen, a group gathered beneath the whispering oaks. Kofi, Elias, a woman named Ruth, who carried knives in her sleeves, and 2 boys barely older than Kofi had been when he first saw the ship. They spoke in hushed tones, plotting, dreaming. Freedom lay northward, past swamps and dogs and bounty hunters. It would be a fire, a distraction. Ruth would light the stables. Elias would lead the way through the cane fields. Kofi would carry the map drawn in charcoal, memorized and hidden in his memory. The night came. Flames danced against the dark sky. Screams erupted. Chaos returned, but this time it was theirs. Kofi ran again, heart pounding, lungs burning. But this time he ran towards something. Freedom. And that, perhaps, is where we pause, for now. But not forever. Smoke curled like black ribbons into the night sky as fire consumed the stables. The scent of burning hay, animal flesh and tarred wood smothered the usual sweetness of sugarcane. Screams pierced the dark, but they were not screams of fear. Not from Kofi. Not this time. He ran low, like Elias had taught him, staying close to the tall stalks of cane that rustled in the wind and masked his movements. Behind him, the plantation's big house was lit in eerie orange, voices yelling, horses whinnying in panic. The guards were scattering, half-drunk, confused, caught off guard. Kofi's legs ached from the sprint, but he kept moving. Ruth had gone south to create a false trail. Elias and the younger boys, Moses and Caleb, had already slipped into the thicket toward the marsh. Kofi followed, heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. Each breath was hard-won, thick with ash and tension. The swamps loomed ahead, dark and buzzing with life. Mosquitoes swarmed his face. Snakes rustled in the undergrowth. The ground sucked at his feet like it wanted him to drown in it. But Kofi pushed forward. He had nothing left behind, only pain, ghosts, and a name they tried to take from him. The map in his mind became his only guide now. Landmarks etched into memory from whispered lessons and silent nights. A crooked cypress tree that bent like an old man. A creek that sang softly over smooth stones. A hollowed log used by runaways to rest, hidden from the moonlight. Each step brought him closer to the path north, toward hope, if not yet freedom. They regrouped near the creek just before dawn. Elias's eyes were bloodshot but alert. Caleb limped, having caught a thorn deep in his foot. Ruth was missing. Kofi didn't ask. He didn't want to hear what silence might say. They moved in the grey half-light, travelling only at night and resting during the day. The forests north of Carolina were thick and wild, but they offered shelter from the sun and the slave catchers who patrolled roads with dogs and iron shackles. Twice they heard the baying of hounds in the distance. Once they had to bury themselves under brush and mud as riders passed only feet away. Caleb, barely 13, wept that night silently. Kofi placed a hand on his shoulder, not to hush him, but to say, "You are still here." That was enough. Days stretched into weeks. Hunger gnawed at them. They ate berries, chewed tree bark, snared rabbits when they could. A kind woman in the woods, a black woman with deep lines on her face and a Bible in her hand, gave them shelter one rainy night. She fed them cornbread and salted pork, and she washed Kofi's wounds with trembling fingers. She didn't ask where they came from. She only said, "You keep going. North don't mean nothing if you turn round." That night, as thunder grumbled in the hills, Kofi dreamed again of his grandfather. This time the old man stood by the river with the fire in his eyes gone, replaced by sorrow. "Many are taken," he said, "but not all are lost." Kofi awoke with tears in his eyes. As they crossed into the mountains of Virginia, the air grew cooler and thinner. The path grew steeper. Caleb collapsed one afternoon and could not rise. They carried him in turns, refusing to leave him. Ruth reappeared 3 days later like a ghost out of the fog, bloodied, exhausted, but alive. She had slit a guard's throat and run for 2 days without rest. When Kofi saw her, he didn't smile, but something loosened in his chest, like the first breath after nearly drowning. The journey was a test of everything Kofi had become. Not a boy, not a slave, but something harder to name. His muscles burned, his ribs showed, his feet bled. But he moved with the purpose of a man who had already died once and had no fear of dying again. Then, at last, they reached the edge of the Shenandoah Valley. Beyond that, Pennsylvania. A land where slavery, while not absent, had been outlawed in name, if not in every soul. There they found an old Quaker man named Elijah, who ran a stop on what others called the Underground Railroad. He welcomed them into his barn, gave them clean water, and allowed them to sleep in real beds stuffed with straw. The softness was strange, almost wrong, after so much hard ground. That night, Kofi could not sleep. He stood by the barn door and looked at the stars. Free stars, northern stars. But freedom, he knew, was not just a place. It was a burden. A fire that burned just as hot as chains did cold. They rested for 3 days. Kofi helped Elijah repair his roof. Elias spoke little, eyes always watching the woods. Ruth stitched new clothes for the boys. Caleb finally smiled again, if only briefly. They traveled onward, farther north. Cities rose from the land like islands in a storm. Philadelphia, then New York. The scent of salt air returned, not of chains and misery this time, but of ships and harbors filled with noise and color. Kofi felt like he was floating through a dream, one that could vanish at any moment if he blinked too long. In New York, he met people who spoke against slavery, men and women, black and white, who risked their lives to print pamphlets and host secret meetings. One of them, a preacher named Samuel, offered Kofi a place to stay, a new name, work in a workshop building wagons. Kofi refused the name. He had kept his too long to trade it now. He stayed, though. He learned to hammer iron, to mend wheels, to read not just survival signs, but letters and books. He found his voice again in that shop. When asked, he would tell others stories, not just of pain, but of resistance, of Elias and Ruth and Caleb, of the village that once stood tall and proud under the Ashanti sun. He became a speaker, a writer, a man others turned to in rooms filled with whispers. Some called him dangerous, others called him brave. He only called himself Kofi. But he never forgot the chains, never forgot the ship, never forgot the night he ran into the cane fields with fire in his lungs and freedom in his blood. And though he now wore a coat and shoes and walked streets instead of swamps, he remained a warrior, not with spears or blades now, but with memory and truth and the steady voice of a man who had seen the depths of cruelty and survived to tell it. Still, when the wind blew from the south and the scent of sugarcane drifted faintly on the breeze, he would close his eyes and remember Esuma, the land, the trees, the people who never made it, and the ones who did. He would whisper their names into the dark. The trees would hear, and so would the stars. He was bound once, but never broken. Winter came with a bitterness Kofi had never known, the kind that settled deep into the bones and made fire feel like a fleeting dream. In New York, the streets wore frost like a second skin. Horses slipped on icy cobblestones, smoke poured endlessly from chimneys, and people pulled their coats tight against a sky that never seemed to thaw. Kofi worked in the wagon shop by day, hammering iron and bending wood, his hands learning new kinds of pain. Clean, honest pain, not the cruel agony of the lash. At night, he attended meetings in basements and churches, places where men and women gathered to speak the unspeakable, to plan, to print, to resist. He never used the word freedom lightly. To Kofi, it was not an ending. It was a path still lined with shadows. Though he no longer wore chains, he lived with the constant awareness that a single word from a Southern sympathizer could mean capture, even in the North. The Fugitive Slave Act had made it law. No black man was truly free unless he crossed into Canada, and even there safety was thin and fragile. Still, Kofi refused to run again, not unless it meant running towards something. He took up writing. Samuel, the preacher who had sheltered him, taught him to read more than just letters. He taught him to read people, their fears, their pride, their ignorance. He helped Kofi pen his story, to share the journey from Esuma to Charleston, from cotton fields to cold alleyways in the Bronx. People wept when they heard it. Some were moved. Others looked away, ashamed. One cold night, Kofi spoke at a small church on the outskirts of Brooklyn. He stood on a rough wooden pulpit, hands trembling slightly, and told the truth. How a boy had once woken in a hut full of smoke and screams. How he had survived a ship meant to erase him. How he had watched too many friends disappear into shallow graves and silent woods. "I am here," he said, voice steady. "Not because I was lucky, but because I would not die quietly." The room fell into a hush that pulsed like thunder in the silence. After the meeting, a man approached him, tall, white, with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers. He introduced himself as Thomas Wells, a printer and abolitionist. He wanted to publish Kofi's words, not just as a pamphlet, but as a book. "Your voice can travel where your body cannot," he said. Kofi hesitated. To speak was to be seen, and to be seen was to be hunted. But then he thought of the ones still bound, still bent beneath the southern sun, and he nodded. The book took months. Kofi wrote by candlelight, dipping quill to ink, pouring memories onto pages. He wrote of Esuma, the rhythm of drums, the feel of red soil. He wrote of the ship, of the smell of death, and the hush of those who had given up. He wrote of Ruth and Elias, of the escape, of the nights spent hiding with fear coiled like a snake in his gut. When the book was published, it spread like wildfire, not just in New York, but in Boston, Philadelphia, and even London. People who had never seen a plantation now saw it through his eyes. They could no longer claim ignorance, but with attention came danger. Kofi began receiving warnings that bounty hunters from the south were traveling north with forged papers and heavy fists, that his name had reached the ears of men who once owned him, that he was no longer just a storyteller, he was now a threat. One evening, as snow fell thick and silent, a boy ran breathless into the workshop where Kofi was hammering out a wagon wheel. "They're coming," the boy whispered. "Men with dogs. They want you." Kofi looked at the snow-covered streets outside, at the world he had built with sweat and stubborn hope. He thought of staying, of fighting. But Samuel's voice echoed in his mind. Sometimes survival is resistance too. That night, Kofi vanished. Not as a fugitive, but as a shadow in the wind. He travelled north, past Albany, through frozen valleys and wind-scoured ridges. He crossed Lake Ontario under cover of night, in a small boat with a smuggler whose eyes never stopped scanning the shoreline. Canada welcomed him with silence and cold. He found work in a small town near Hamilton, chopping wood, fixing fences, writing under a false name. It was not the life he dreamed of, but it was life. Years passed, and slowly others began to arrive. Women carrying infants swaddled in scraps, men missing fingers or eyes or years. They came with nothing but the ache of survival in their bones. And Kofi helped them. He built a house with his own hands, a wide, strong house with space enough for many. They called it the Ashanti home. It became a haven, a way station, a fire in the wilderness. There, by the warmth of its hearth, he told stories, not of grief, but of strength, of how fire could burn and heal, of how memory could be armor, of how names could survive ships and whips and lies. He told children about Esuma, and how the trees once danced in the wind. He told them that no one could ever take who you are, not truly. He told them that even if you are bound, you can still rise. Even if the world tries to crush your voice, you can still speak. Even if you carry scars, you can still build something that lives beyond you. And in that snowy, quiet corner of a distant land, the warrior named Kofi lived not as a slave, or even as a man freed by another's hand, but as a soul who had freed himself. Years melted into each other like frost on early spring leaves. Canada offered peace, but not silence. In the quietness of the northern fields, there were still echoes of chains, soft but unrelenting, that lived in Kofi's bones. He heard them sometimes when the wind curled through the tall grass. He felt them in his sleep when the fire in the hearth burned low. The world had changed, but the past had not released him. Still, he worked. Each day, Kofi rose before the sun, hands calloused and back bowed with effort but not defeat. The Ashanti home grew. Where once there stood a single cabin, there were now 3, then 6. Families came, runaways with eyes dulled by fear, women with backs striped by the whip, boys who had forgotten how to laugh. He built beds with wood from the nearby forest. He carved names into the frames, a promise to those who had lost theirs. In this place, no one was ever called boy or girl in shame. No one bowed unless it was to give thanks. Here the songs returned, not the shouts of the field, but the old ones, the ones sung by firelight long ago in Esuma. And yet Kofi could never fully rest. News travelled slowly, but it travelled. From travellers and messengers came word of war brewing in the south. Tensions between north and south rising like storm clouds. Slavery long tolerated now lit political halls on fire. Kofi listened carefully, silently, as names like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were spoken with reverence and fear. He did not see himself as they did. He had never led masses or crossed back into danger. But deep inside, he knew something was shifting, something that called to the fire inside him that had never died. One night, a stranger arrived at the Ashanti home. Tall, wrapped in a worn coat, rifle strapped to his back, he introduced himself as Josiah, a conductor on the Underground Railroad and a former soldier in Haiti's revolution before fleeing the Caribbean uprisings. His eyes met Kofi's, and for a moment the silence between them said more than words. "I need men," Josiah said. "Men like you." Kofi looked toward the trees, where smoke from the chimney curled into a pale moonlit sky. For what? "Trouble is coming," Josiah said. The kind that don't leave folk alone just because they crossed a line in the dirt. We mean to be ready. That night, Kofi didn't sleep. He sat on the porch of the Ashanti home, his blanket around his shoulders, a small fire burning low in the pit before him. He remembered Elias, the man who had taught him how to fight in the fields, how to move in the shadows. He remembered Ruth and her bloodied hands. He remembered the ship, the village, the bones beneath the sugar fields. He had been running for so long. Now, the fight was coming north. By spring, Kofi began training again, not for survival, but for resistance. He built a training yard behind the cabins. He taught boys how to move silently through woods. He taught women how to handle knives, how to snare animals, how to vanish into trees. He taught what Elias had taught him: strength without cruelty, silence without submission. They practiced at dawn and again by firelight. There were no uniforms, no ranks, but there was purpose. Kofi became a leader not because he claimed to be, but because his presence steadied even the most broken. Then, one cold autumn morning, news came by letter. South Carolina had seceded. War had begun. The Ashanti home changed. No longer just a place of rest, it became a refuge for fighters, a place where scouts stopped to gather food and supplies, where fugitives regrouped before heading to safe havens deeper into the country. It became a hub, a hidden fortress under the guise of a farmstead. Kofi knew what it meant. Blood would spill north and south, and the question of slavery would no longer be whispered, it would be shouted through cannon fire. He joined Josiah on scouting missions near the Great Lakes, aiding escaped men enlisting in the colored regiments of the Union Army. He taught others how to read maps by moonlight, how to read the land like scripture. Once, while passing through Buffalo, he saw a wanted poster bearing a sketch that looked like him. Escaped property from Charleston. Reward $500. He didn't flinch. He tore it down, burned it in the alley, and kept walking. But not all dangers came from the south. Some in the north whispered against the presence of black soldiers, against men like Kofi bearing arms or walking openly in their towns. One night, returning from a food run with a small group of scouts, he was ambushed by 3 white men outside of a tavern in Rochester. They struck without words, dragging him into an alley, fists like hammers, boots like falling stones. He might have died there, but he didn't. He fought. And when he rose, bloodied and bruised, the alley held only silence and the bodies of the men who underestimated what strength lived in a man who had already survived hell. When he returned to the Ashanti home, Ruth was waiting. Not dead, not gone. Older now, her face lined with wind and struggle, but alive. "I thought I'd find you here," she said. He embraced her for the first time in over a decade. She had stories of her own, of helping others through the railroad, of losing a child, of burning down a Georgia outpost when soldiers tried to take her again. She had never stopped fighting, only paused to breathe. Together they stood side by side as the war raged far and near. Together they turned the Ashanti home into something more than refuge. It became a legacy. As the years passed and the war dragged on, Kofi never lost focus. Not even when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. Not even when Union victories turned the tide. He understood too well. Words on paper did not end chains. Action did. Then, one spring morning, a rider came galloping up the hill, shouting news before his horse even stopped moving. "It's over! Lee surrendered! It's over!" The war had ended. Slavery as law had fallen. Kofi sat down on the grass, his hands shaking, not from joy, but from the weight of the moment. From the memory of all who did not live to see this day. He thought of Caleb, who had died during the journey north from fever. He thought of Elias, who had disappeared into the night after one last mission. He thought of his grandfather, who once said, "Many are taken, but not all are lost." Now Kofi knew what that meant. He was no longer bound. He had never been broken. And now the fire he carried could be passed forward, not as rage, but as light. Not as grief, but as remembrance. Though the war had ended, peace did not arrive on golden wings. For many it came quietly, suspiciously, like a stranger at the door, knocking once, then lingering. In the southern states, shackles had fallen, but hatred remained, rooting itself in laws, in land, in looks. The whip was replaced by the noose. the overseer by the deputy. Kofi knew this truth before the ink on surrender papers had even dried. In Canada, the air felt different, crisper, freer, but even there, whispers slithered beneath smiles. Still, he stood tall. The Ashanti home had grown into a full village, an independent community nestled in pine and snow, with its own schoolhouse, blacksmith, orchard, and graveyard. Kofi built it with his hands and spirit, stone by stone, tree by tree. What began as a place to hide had become a place to belong. Children who had never seen cotton fields ran through wildflower meadows, their laughter echoing like songs. They learned to read in two languages, English and Twi. They recited proverbs brought over the ocean generations ago. They called Kofi Baba, and when he passed, they placed their small hands on his shoulders like he was a tree they could lean on. But Kofi could not stay still. He had witnessed too much. The war had ended, but a deeper fight was beginning. The fight for dignity, for land, for voice. Black families in America, newly freed, wandered rootless, jobless, facing lynch mobs and broken promises. Reconstruction had begun, but it was a foundation of splinters and shifting stones. Some black soldiers were given land, most were not. Some were offered education, many were blocked at the schoolhouse door. Kofi began crossing back into the United States, not as a runaway, but as a builder. He traveled with Ruth, with Josiah, and a wagon loaded with seeds, tools, and books. In Georgia, they helped plant gardens where cotton had once torn the earth. In Mississippi, they built shelters beside burned churches. In Tennessee, they taught freedmen how to write their names in cursive letters that curled like hope. Sometimes they were greeted with gratitude, other times with shotguns. In one small Alabama town, Kofi was arrested for inciting unrest after holding a reading circle under a tree. A white judge sentenced him to 30 lashes and forced labor. He did not beg. He took each blow without sound, blood running down his back like rain down a roof. He escaped on the 12th night of his sentence. Ruth found him in a barn north of the state line, burning with fever, his back a road map of red scars. She nursed him for a week, wrapping his wounds with cloth soaked in herbs and warm water. He whispered once through cracked lips, "They cannot kill what is already free." When he healed, he returned to work. He no longer needed to prove he had survived. His every step shouted it. He was known in freedmen's communities as the man with the fireback and iron eyes. Children ran to him not in fear, but reverence. He didn't tell them of pain. He told them stories of stars over Esuma, of mango trees and mothers who braided strength into hair. He spoke to elders about land ownership and farming cooperatives. He helped register voters. He held guns when needed. In 1870, 5 years after the war, Kofi and Ruth stood beneath a pecan tree as a young black man voted for the first time. Tears rolled down the man's cheeks as he dipped the pen and signed his name. Kofi didn't cry. He simply placed his hand on the man's shoulder. That night, they buried a small box beneath the tree. Inside, a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, a worn Bible, a lock of Ruth's hair, and a carving of an Adinkra symbol. E-Ban, the symbol of safety and security. "We bury not the past," Kofi said. "We plant it." But freedom was always under siege. White supremacy rose like a tide disguised in law and hoods. The Ku Klux Klan moved like ghosts with guns, burning black homes, churches, and hope. Kofi lost friends. He buried too many. In one ambush outside of Louisiana, he was shot in the leg while trying to defend a schoolhouse. He limped for months afterward, but he refused a cane. "Pain is no longer my master," he told Ruth. As the years passed, his hair grayed, then silvered. His back bent, not from submission, but from carrying too much for too long. Still, he worked. Still, he taught. Still, he fought. He returned often to Canada, where the Ashanti home still stood, now tended by others, by children who had grown tall, by women who remembered the girl Ruth had been, fists and fire. In time, they built a statue in the Ashanti home square, not of Kofi, but of a tree, strong, rooted, reaching upward. Beneath it a plaque read, "Here stood the bound who would not bow. Here lived the broken who mended the world." Kofi never asked for it, never posed, never wept when it was unveiled. He just placed his hand on its trunk and closed his eyes. In his final years, he returned once more to Esuma, or what remained of it. He crossed the Atlantic not as cargo, but as a traveler. He walked through jungles that no longer knew his name. The village was gone, burned, rebuilt, forgotten. But the land still whispered. He sat by the riverbank where he once fished as a child. He took off his shoes and let the red earth touch his skin again. He spoke aloud, not expecting answers. "I was taken, but I returned." He stayed 3 months, speaking with elders, teaching children how to carve tools, how to grow from seeds. Then he left again, not to flee, but to pass on the fire one more time. Back in Canada, in the quiet cold of one final winter, Kofi passed in his sleep. No chains, no pain, just rest. He left behind no wealth, no titles, no photographs, only seeds, only stories, only fire. And in every corner of the land, north, south, coast to coast, those who knew him would say he walked through hell and made it a road for others. Years passed like the slow turning of the earth. The world moved on, but it could not forget. In the generations after Kofi's death, his name was not shouted in newspapers nor carved in marble in the great cities. But in the corners of Black America, in schoolhouses made of scrap wood, in sharecroppers' cabins with leaking roofs, in churches with broken windows, his story was spoken like scripture. They called him Baba Kofi, the Ashanti Fire. Some thought him myth, a spirit that rose from bondage to teach and protect. Others knew better. Their grandmothers had walked with him. Their uncles had followed him through southern fields. Their homes had been saved by his hands. He became legend, not by dying grandly, but by living truthfully. Ruth remained for a while in Canada, tending the Ashanti home with her remaining strength. She aged like stone, weathered but unmoved. When she finally passed, her ashes were buried beneath the same pecan tree where she and Kofi had planted the past. She left behind a box, sealed tight, addressed to those not yet born. Inside was a journal. Written in her hand, it told everything. Not the legend, the truth. About a boy from Esuma, stolen by violence, hardened by survival, softened by faith, remade by fire. About ships that crossed oceans, names that were stolen, whips that could not kill the soul. About a man who chose not vengeance but vision, who built homes out of nothing, who made a family from the broken, who taught people not only how to run, but how to rise. The journal moved from hand to hand. A teacher in New York used it to start a Black history curriculum in the 1890s. A preacher in Mississippi built his sermons from its pages. A Harlem writer in the 1920s turned parts of it into verse. It lived on. In 1935, a young boy named Elijah found the journal in his grandfather's attic in Philadelphia. He read it by candlelight every night for weeks, his eyes wide, his fingers tracing each name like scripture. When he finished, he wrote 3 words on the last page: "I will continue." Elijah grew up to become a lawyer, then a judge, then a congressman, and on the day he swore into office, he carried the journal in his breast pocket, not as a symbol, but as a promise. The world kept changing. Wars came and went. Walls fell, marches filled streets, laws shifted, but still the fight remained. In the civil rights marches of the 1960s, young men with afro picks in their pockets whispered of Kofi as they linked arms on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. When the fire hoses blasted them and the dogs lunged, they imagined the whip on Kofi's back, the fire in his hands. They did not move. In the Black Power lectures of the 1970s, his name was spoken in university halls not as myth, but as blueprint. In whispered gatherings of freedom schools, the children repeated his lessons like gospel. Never bow unless in prayer, never silence truth, never forget where you come from. In South Africa, when apartheid roared, a teacher shared Kofi's story with her students, drawing maps of his path across oceans, from Esuma to Charleston to Canada to beyond. You are never just victims, she told them. You are seeds. And in 2008, when a black man placed his hand on a Bible and took the oath of the American presidency, a great-great-grandchild of Ruth stood in the crowd, clutching the necklace that once belonged to her, tears pouring silently down his cheeks. He did not cry for the moment. He cried for the memory, for the ship, for the chains, for the night in the woods when Kofi carried a dying boy on his back, for the woman who bled in the fields and never broke, for the children born into shadow who became stars, for all the names erased that could now be spoken. And in the crowd that day, among millions, a girl with dark skin and bright eyes stood on her father's shoulders, waving a tiny flag. She did not know who Kofi was. Not yet, but she would. Because one day her father